In a small, upscale neighborhood, there lived a wealthy man named Mr. Thompson. He was the kind of person who enjoyed the luxuries of life, living in a grand house filled with expensive furniture, fine art, and a high-end lifestyle that few could imagine. But there was something about him that didn't quite match the elegance of his surroundings: his attitude. Mr. Thompson had a tendency to look down on people who worked for him, especially those who came from different backgrounds. He had no problem making it clear that he felt superior to anyone who didn't share his social status or wealth. Among the people who worked for him was a kind-hearted black maid named Rosa. Rosa was in her early 30s and had been working for Mr. Thompson for several years. She was dependable, always showing up on time, and made sure the house was clean, organized, and welcoming. But despite her diligence and hard work, Mr. Thompson didn't see her as anything more than someone who was there to serve him. He never hesitated to make rude remarks, often speaking to her in a condescending tone, making sure she knew her place in his eyes. Rosa, however, never retaliated. She came from a strong family background, where respect for others was instilled deeply, no matter their race or status. She was proud of her work, and although Mr. Thompson's attitude hurt her, she kept her head high. Rosa knew that she had a job to do, and she was determined to do it well. She also had dreams of providing a better life for her family. She would often work long hours, cleaning the large house and making sure everything was perfect, all the while ignoring Mr. Thompson's jabs and dismissive behavior. Mr. Thompson didn't even try to hide his disrespect. He often made comments about her being just a maid and belittled her for working in a position he considered lowly. He would sometimes joke, though not in a funny way, about how someone like Rosa could never understand the finer things in life. Rosa would nod silently, continuing with her tasks, her heart heavy but her face composed. Despite his behavior, Rosa did her best to maintain her professionalism. She treated him with politeness, answering his questions and doing whatever was asked without complaint. Rosa had learned early on in life that responding with kindness and patience was the best way to handle situations like this. She didn't expect Mr. Thompson to ever change. In fact, she was almost certain that he would always see her as nothing more than a hired worker. But that didn't stop her from being the best she could be. One evening, after a long day of cleaning, Rosa was finishing up the last of her chores. She was putting away the cleaning supplies in the kitchen when Mr. Thompson walked by, barely acknowledging her presence. He didn't say anything but gave her a look that was cold and dismissive, as if she was invisible. Rosa had gotten used to it by now, but the sting of his disregard never fully went away. She just sighed quietly to herself and continued her work, knowing that the next day would bring more of the same. What she didn't know, however, was that everything was about to change in a way neither she nor Mr. Thompson could have ever imagined. That night, Mr. Thompson would come face to face with the woman he had always looked down on in the most unexpected way. And Rosa, with her quiet strength, would show him a side of herself that would change both of their lives forever. It was a typical day in Mr. Thompson's home, with the usual bustle of servants preparing meals, cleaning, and attending to his every need. The house was large and sprawling, with high ceilings and rooms filled with antique furniture that seemed to carry a sense of history. But the air in the house felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were a reminder of the divide between the people who lived there and the people who worked there. Rosa was going about her duties as usual. She had just finished dusting the long rows of bookshelves in the living room and was now heading to the kitchen to prepare the next meal for her employer. As she passed through the grand hallway, she could hear Mr. Thompson's voice coming from the study, raising the volume of his words, clearly in the middle of a phone call. His words, sharp and dismissive, dripped with an air of superiority. "Honestly, I don't know why they keep sending these people," he was saying to someone on the other end of the line. "They're fine for cleaning, but what do they really know about the finer things in life? I mean, look at her. She's not even qualified for anything beyond scrubbing floors." Rosa froze just outside the study door, her heart sinking. She knew who he was talking about. There was no doubt in her mind. It was her. He was talking about her, the woman who had worked tirelessly for him, always giving her best, no matter how he treated her. Rosa stood still for a moment, trying to steady her breath. She wanted to believe that his words didn't hurt, but they did. No matter how strong she tried to be, being constantly belittled by someone she worked so hard for had taken its toll. Rosa closed her eyes briefly, letting the sting of his words wash over her for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, she straightened up and walked quietly into the kitchen, pushing her emotions aside. She had a job to do. She put the kettle on to boil and started chopping vegetables for the evening meal. Every chop of the knife, every step she took felt mechanical, almost robotic. The kitchen was her safe space, a place where she could focus solely on the task at hand. Here in this room, her value wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion of her. She was doing something real, something that mattered. Rosa wasn't the type to show her feelings outwardly. She had learned long ago to mask her pain and move forward, keeping a calm exterior no matter the internal storm. She had bigger dreams than this, dreams of a future where she could build a life of her own, free from judgment. Rosa wanted to one day run her own business, to be her own boss, but for now, she was stuck in this job, doing the best she could with what she had. As she worked, the sounds of Mr. Thompson's footsteps echoed down the hallway. He passed by the kitchen, pausing for just a moment as he glanced into the room. Rosa quickly looked up at him, offering a polite nod, but he simply grunted and moved on, not bothering to acknowledge her presence. It was the same thing every day. Rosa had grown used to it, but each time it still stung. She knew she deserved more than this, more than being treated like she was invisible. Days passed by, and Rosa continued her work at Mr. Thompson's home, maintaining the same level of professionalism and grace. She had always prided herself on being strong and composed, no matter the circumstances. She had learned early on in life that hard work was the key to success, and while it didn't always bring recognition, it was the path she had chosen. Rosa was determined to build a better future for herself and her family. But despite all her efforts, the harsh treatment from Mr. Thompson continued. On the outside, Rosa's life seemed steady. She had a routine: work, take care of her family, sleep, and then do it all over again. But in her heart, there was a yearning for something more. She dreamed of a life where she wasn't just another worker in someone else's home. Rosa longed for respect, not just as a maid, but as a person with hopes, dreams, and ambitions. Every time Mr. Thompson looked down on her or made dismissive comments, it reminded her of the barriers she faced, the obstacles that seemed to make her dreams feel out of reach. Her family, though, had always been her rock. They supported her decisions, and she made it clear to them that her work, though challenging, was part of a larger plan. Rosa knew it was only temporary. She had ambitions of starting her own small business, one that would give her the independence she craved. She had no illusions about how hard it would be, but that didn't deter her. Rosa was patient, and she knew her time would come. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, had little awareness of the struggles Rosa faced. To him, she was just another employee, someone he could treat however he pleased. He had no real understanding of the sacrifices she made every day, the quiet strength she carried with her, or the aspirations that lived in her heart. His world was filled with luxury, business deals, and social gatherings, where people of his status came and went. He had never really thought beyond the bubble he lived in, where his money and connections protected him from having to confront uncomfortable truths about people like Rosa. One afternoon, while Rosa was in the middle of scrubbing the kitchen floor, Mr. Thompson walked into the room with a look of annoyance on his face. He had just returned from a long meeting, his mood sour from a frustrating day. He barely noticed Rosa as he passed her, muttering under his breath about the inefficiencies of his day. Rosa continued to work quietly, not reacting to his words, though they stung. She had learned to ignore the disrespect. After all, she was just a maid in his eyes. It wasn't her place to challenge him, or so she thought. As she continued her cleaning, She couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration building up inside her. There was so much more to her than what he saw. She was strong, capable, and worthy of more than the cold, dismissive treatment she had received. But Rosa didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts for long. Her family needed her, and she couldn't afford to lose focus. She reminded herself that her time would come, her chance to break free from the cycle of hard work without recognition. It wasn't just about changing her own life, but providing for her loved ones, giving them opportunities that she never had. Little did Rosa know, her moment was about to arrive. The next few hours would change everything. Everything about her relationship with Mr. Thompson, everything about her life, and everything she thought she knew about human kindness and strength. The events that were about to unfold would force them both to confront their beliefs, their biases, and their own capacity for change. What happened next would reveal that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the greatest transformations. It was late in the afternoon when the unexpected happened. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow through the large windows of Mr. Thompson's home. Rosa was just finishing up her chores for the day. She had cleaned the main rooms, wiped down the countertops, and prepared dinner. Her body was tired from hours of work, but she was used to it. It had been a long day, and she was looking forward to a quiet evening at home with her family. She was almost done with her tasks when a loud, sudden noise broke the calm in the house. At first, Rosa wasn't sure what she had heard. It sounded like a thud, followed by a faint groan. She paused, listening carefully. It came from the direction of the study where Mr. Thompson often worked. Confused, she slowly made her way down the hallway, hoping that whatever had caused the noise was nothing serious. But as she got closer, she heard it again. A sharp gasp for air, followed by a desperate wheeze. Rosa's heart skipped a beat. She knew instantly what was happening. Mr. Thompson was in trouble. Without thinking, Rosa rushed into the study. There, she found Mr. Thompson lying on the floor, his face flushed and his breathing erratic. He was clutching his chest, his eyes wide with panic. His lips were turning pale, and he was gasping for breath, as though he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. Rosa's training as a first aid volunteer kicked in. She didn't have time to think about how he had treated her or the things he had said. All that mattered now was saving his life. She quickly knelt beside him, trying to stay calm. She placed her hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him even though she herself was scared. "Mr. Thompson," she said firmly, "I need you to focus. You're having a heart attack. I'm going to help you." Despite his obvious distress, he barely seemed to hear her. His face was contorted in pain, and his chest heaved with every breath. Rosa knew she had to act fast. She had learned how to perform CPR and other emergency procedures, and now it was time to put that knowledge to the test. Rosa immediately placed her hands over Mr. Thompson's chest, using firm compressions to help circulate blood. She counted steadily in her head, keeping track of the seconds as she worked. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't have the luxury of panic. This was a life-or-death moment, and every second mattered. Mr. Thompson's breathing was shallow, and for a moment, she feared that he wouldn't make it. But Rosa kept going, her determination unwavering. She had saved lives before, and she wasn't about to let this man slip away without doing everything in her power to help him. Her heart raced, but she remained focused, blocking out all thoughts of the years of mistreatment she had endured. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she heard a faint cough, followed by a soft, ragged breath. Mr. Thompson's chest moved slightly, and his eyes fluttered open. His gaze was blurry at first, but as his vision cleared, he looked up at Rosa with a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Rosa?" he whispered, his voice weak. "What? What happened? How did you?" Rosa didn't answer him right away. Instead, she gave him a small, reassuring smile, though she could feel her own heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had saved his life. And for the first time, The man who had treated her with such disdain was now looking at her with something entirely new in his eyes: vulnerability. As Rosa sat beside Mr. Thompson, watching him take slow, careful breaths, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of disbelief. Just moments before, he had been lying on the floor, gasping for air, unaware of how close he had come to losing everything. Now, here he was, looking at her with a mix of confusion and gratitude. It was hard for her to process. How could someone who had treated her with such coldness and disrespect be so vulnerable now? Mr. Thompson blinked a few times, still trying to gather his senses. His face was pale, but he was breathing more steadily, thanks to the quick action Rosa had taken. He looked at her with a faint hint of awe, as if he couldn't quite comprehend what had just happened. "Why did you?" he began, his voice shaky. He seemed to struggle for the right words. "Why did you help me?" Rosa simply looked at him, trying not to let his question affect her too much. She had done what anyone would have done in her place. She had acted quickly because it was the right thing to do, not because of anything else. She had saved his life, but that didn't change the years of mistreatment she had endured at his hands. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thompson," she said softly, though her voice was steady. "And I couldn't just let you lie there." Her words were simple, yet they carried weight. She wasn't looking for praise, nor did she want to explain herself. The truth was, in that moment, she had forgotten about the years of resentment and frustration. All that mattered was that a life was at risk, and she had done what she needed to do. Mr. Thompson sat up slowly, still holding his chest as if trying to make sense of the sudden turn of events. He seemed lost in thought, his mind likely struggling to grasp the gravity of what had just happened. His eyes briefly glanced at Rosa again, but this time there was no arrogance in them, no superiority. Instead, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the kindness and bravery she had shown, qualities he had never expected from someone he had so often looked down on. For a few moments, the room was filled with silence. Rosa didn't speak, and Mr. Thompson didn't ask any more questions. It was as if they were both caught in an unspoken understanding. Rosa was the one who had saved him, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in a long while, Mr. Thompson began to realize that there was more to her than just the maid who worked in his house. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate for the situation, for what he was feeling. For years, he had treated Rosa as nothing more than a person in the background of his life, someone who could be ignored or even belittled. But now, after what had just happened, he couldn't ignore the complexity of who she was, or the strength she had shown in that moment. It was a humbling realization, one that stirred something deep within him. Rosa, however, didn't linger on the moment. She was aware of the reality of the situation. She had acted on instinct, and now that he was safe, she had work to finish. The dinner still needed to be served, the house needed tidying, and her family was waiting for her at home. "Mr. Thompson, I'll call the doctor to make sure you're okay," she said, rising from her seat. "But I need to get back to my duties now. You're in good hands now." Mr. Thompson nodded silently, still processing everything. He watched as Rosa walked toward the phone, her movements calm and professional, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. For the first time, he was beginning to see her in a different light, and though he couldn't fully comprehend it yet, he knew that he would never be able to look at her the same way again. As Rosa picked up the phone to call the doctor, Mr. Thompson remained sitting on the floor, deep in thought. He was alive because of her. She had saved him, someone who had never shown her the respect she deserved. And in that moment, a shift began in him, though it was only the beginning of a much deeper transformation. The days that followed Mr. Thompson's heart attack were filled with a strange quiet in the house. Rosa had done her part by making sure he received the care he needed, calling the doctor and ensuring that he took the prescribed medication. She continued with her work, tending to her duties around the house, but something had shifted. The air felt different now, heavier in a way that made every interaction feel more meaningful. Mr. Thompson, though recovering, wasn't the same. He no longer passed by Rosa with his usual dismissiveness. He still didn't say much to her, but there was something unspoken in the way he looked at her now. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, not as just an employee, but as someone who had saved his life. It was an awkward shift for both of them. Rosa didn't know how to feel about it. She wasn't looking for gratitude, but the change in him was undeniable. He had spent several days recovering in his study, and when he finally came downstairs, he seemed a little weaker but also different. He appeared more aware of his surroundings, more thoughtful in his actions. One morning, as Rosa was setting the breakfast table, he entered the room. His usual, aloof expression had softened, replaced by a look of hesitation. He paused for a moment, as if unsure of how to approach her. "Rosa," he began, his voice still rough from the strain of the previous days. I just wanted to thank you for what you did. I don't know how to repay you." Rosa looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Mr. Thompson had never addressed her this way before. His words were hesitant, as though he were struggling with his pride. It was clear that he didn't fully understand how to process the change in their relationship, but the fact that he was even trying to acknowledge it was something new. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Thompson," Rosa said gently, her voice steady as always. "I just did what anyone would have done." There was no bitterness in her words, no attempt to make him feel guilty. She wasn't interested in rehashing the past. She had saved his life, and that was enough for her. She didn't want to hold anything over him. She simply wanted to move forward, continuing with her work and leaving behind the animosity that had once defined their interactions. Mr. Thompson, however, wasn't ready to let go of the moment. He stood there for a few seconds, as if weighing his words. "I've been thinking," he said, still holding the doorframe as though uncertain whether to cross the threshold into the kitchen, "about the way I've treated you. And I realize I've been wrong. You don't deserve that." Rosa turned back to the table, busying herself with adjusting the plates, though she could feel her heart quicken. This was unexpected. She had never once thought Mr. Thompson would acknowledge his behavior, let alone apologize for it. It was strange hearing him admit to something that she had known for so long. "You've always been kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it," he continued, his voice softer now. "I can't change what I've done, but I want you to know that I respect you. More than I ever did before." Rosa nodded, unsure of what to say. She appreciated his words, though they weren't what she had been waiting for. She had never needed his respect to feel good about herself. She knew her worth, and his approval didn't change that. But there was something important about this moment. It wasn't about her. This was about him. He was the one changing, and that was something to be noted. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm. "But I'm just here to do my job. Nothing more." Mr. Thompson didn't press further. He simply nodded, and the two of them fell into an uneasy silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are on the brink of a shift, unsure of where to go next, but knowing that something is different. As the days went on, the atmosphere in the house continued to evolve. Mr. Thompson began to act with more consideration, offering small gestures of kindness that he never had before. Sometimes he would simply ask if Rosa needed anything, or if there was something he could do to help her. The changes were small, but they were enough to make Rosa notice. She didn't let it affect her work, but it was impossible to ignore the shift. In his heart, Mr. Thompson knew that he would never be the same. He had seen a side of Rosa that he hadn't been able or willing to see before. And though he couldn't fully explain it, he knew that his perspective on her, and on himself, had changed forever. The days that followed continued in a quieter, more thoughtful rhythm. Rosa kept her head down, focused on her work, and tried not to let the changes in Mr. Thompson's behavior distract her. She didn't need his validation or approval. She knew that her worth wasn't tied to his opinions of her, no matter how much his treatment had stung in the past. Her life was more than what happened in his house, more than the years of his disrespect. However, something was different now. Mr. Thompson was trying to understand what he had once overlooked. At first, it was small gestures, a word of thanks here, a light conversation there. But slowly, they became more frequent, more genuine. It wasn't that Rosa was holding on to these small moments for any kind of recognition, but they were a stark contrast to the coldness she had once endured. The change wasn't instant, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was there, and that was enough for her. One morning, Mr. Thompson was downstairs early. Rosa had arrived for her usual shift, already in the kitchen preparing the breakfast. She could hear him moving around in the living room, and it was strange. He had never been up this early, much less up before her. The silence between them, while lessened over time, still had an awkward quality to it, as if neither of them knew exactly how to proceed. She finished setting the table, and as she made her way to the living room to check if he needed anything, she found him sitting on the couch, staring out the window. His expression was distant, almost lost in thought, as though he were grappling with something heavy. Rosa paused at the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt or let him be. He seemed so different now, more vulnerable, more human. Mr. Thompson noticed her standing there. He didn't seem startled by her presence, though, as he would have been before. He turned to her, offering a soft, tired smile. "Good morning, Rosa," he said, his voice calm but tired. There was something in his eyes now, a sincerity that had never been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Rosa replied, keeping her tone polite, but not overly familiar. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into a new kind of relationship with him. She had always kept her distance for a reason, and she wasn't about to let his attempts to change alter her professionalism. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was one of those moments where words felt unnecessary. The world outside was still, and inside, it felt like they were in a space suspended in time, where the past couldn't reach them, but neither had figured out what the future would hold. Finally, Mr. Thompson spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said, his gaze shifting back to the window. "I never realized how much I took for granted. How much people like you have to go through." Rosa didn't respond right away. She had heard his apology in his words before, but hearing it again, this time more raw, more personal, made her pause. He was finally acknowledging the unspoken, his privilege, his ignorance, and the harm he had caused. "You've always been kind to me," he continued, his eyes turning to meet hers, "even when I didn't deserve it. And I don't know why I treated you the way I did." Rosa felt a small shift inside her, but she didn't allow herself to get caught up in it. She had always known that change didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen just because someone said the right words. People could change, but it took more than words to make that change real. "I've done things in my life that I regret," Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "But I don't want to be the kind of person who overlooks the value of someone just because they don't fit my idea of who they should be." Rosa simply nodded. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate his words. She did. But she knew better than to rely solely on promises. Words were one thing, but actions were another. And for now, she was content to wait and see if his change was something he would carry through or if it would fade away with time. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "But we'll see if you can make that change, Mr. Thompson." Her words were not harsh, but they were clear. She wasn't going to let herself be caught up in what he said now, not when years of behavior couldn't be erased with a few kind words. She would wait, patiently, to see if the respect he spoke of was something he would consistently show, not just to her, but to everyone. Mr. Thompson didn't seem upset by her response. If anything, there was a small, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. He knew that words alone couldn't erase everything, that the path to change was long and uncertain. But in that moment, he also understood that it was worth trying. For Rosa, the road ahead wasn't clear, but there was a small, hopeful flicker inside her. Things had shifted, yes. As the weeks went by, Rosa noticed the subtle but steady transformation in Mr. Thompson. He wasn't perfect, but there were small, consistent changes that showed he was truly trying to be different. He began to greet her with more respect, acknowledging her presence without that old dismissive air. His conversations with her became more genuine, and he started asking her how her day was going, something he had never done before. Rosa could tell that he was making an effort, though she remained cautious. She had learned not to expect too much from someone who had shown so little consideration in the past. Rosa didn't let herself get caught up in this newfound civility. She remained professional, as always. Her focus stayed on her work and her family, as it had for so many years. She knew that actions spoke louder than words, and while Mr. Thompson's behavior had changed, she needed to see if it would last. She wasn't interested in false promises or fleeting gestures. She needed to see real growth, a change that went beyond just being polite to her. One afternoon, after finishing her work, Rosa was about to leave for the day when Mr. Thompson called her into the living room. She hadn't expected it, and she hesitated for a moment before walking in. He was sitting in the same chair by the window, his usual stern expression replaced with something softer. He looked up at her as she entered, his eyes filled with an unexpected warmth. "Rosa," he began, his voice quieter than usual, almost as if he were unsure of how to continue. "I've been thinking about everything, and I know I can never undo the things I've said or done. But I want you to know that I truly respect you, not just because you saved my life, but because of who you are, your strength, your kindness, everything." Rosa stood still, absorbing his words. She had heard many apologies over the years, but something about the way he spoke now made it clear that this wasn't just another empty attempt. There was sincerity in his voice, a humility she had never heard from him before. It wasn't about her forgiving him. It was about him finally understanding. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," he continued, his gaze steady. "But I'm committed to being better, not just toward you, but toward everyone." Rosa remained quiet for a moment, unsure of what to say. She didn't want to dismiss his apology, but she also didn't want to give the impression that everything was instantly forgiven. She had spent years guarding herself against people who said one thing and did another. She needed to see whether he could truly change, or if this was just another momentary shift that would fade over time. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I'll be watching, like I always do. Words are easy, but actions speak louder. I believe in change, but it takes time." He nodded, as if understanding her unspoken message. There was no argument, no defensiveness. He didn't try to convince her or make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he simply looked at her with respect. Real, genuine respect that seemed to come from a place of self-awareness. In the days that followed, Rosa noticed more changes. Mr. Thompson began to speak more kindly to others, not just her. He would ask the staff if they needed anything, show more consideration for their work, and even made an effort to learn their names. It was a quiet transformation, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Rosa saw him interacting with others, not just with respect, but with humility, and for the first time, she felt like he was truly becoming a better person. But for Rosa, the most significant change was how he treated her. There was no longer any condescension, no coldness. He still wasn't perfect, but the relationship between them had evolved into something more equitable, grounded in mutual respect. It wasn't just about the work she did for him. It was about recognizing her as a person. Rosa's own perspective had shifted too. She didn't feel the same anger or resentment she had once carried. Instead, she found herself quietly hopeful. She hadn't expected this kind of change, and while she still remained cautious, there was a part of her that couldn't deny the possibility of growth, both in Mr. Thompson and in herself. One evening, as Rosa prepared to leave for the day, Mr. Thompson approached her by the door. "Thank you," he said simply, his words heartfelt. "For everything." Rosa smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "You're welcome," she replied. "Just keep doing better." And with that, she left, her heart a little lighter than when she had arrived. Rosa didn't need grand gestures or extravagant apologies. She needed honesty, change, and a real sense of respect. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had seen all of those things. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for Rosa, this was a step in the right direction, for both of them.